series in trade policy issues. Today we have a really special session. As you had already received, today we're going to talk about trade, COVID, and Africa, a topic not normally being debated in Chile or Latin America, but quite important to know what's happening in other regions in the world. In this case, what's happening in Africa with the COVID pandemic, and particularly with trade issues. And for this, I have the pleasure, we as Institute have the pleasure to receive two friends, I would like to say, two great colleagues, great professionals. First, Professor Tabitha Kiriti from the University of Nairobi, who's an economist and also WTO chairholder for Kenya. She's been a long-time friend, and we have shared in the Untitled Institute initiative, in the WTO Chairs initiative, and it's really great to have you here in this online seminar. And also we have Dr. Richard Newfarmer from the International Growth Center, one of the most prestigious think tanks on international economic issues and development issues, who is country director for Uganda and Rwanda, and a great specialist on international trade issues in general, and in particular for trade in Africa and development in Africa. So we'll have the opportunity to learn from two great professors. We really thank you for being here for this opportunity. And we will start with Professor Newfarmer and follow up with Professor Kiriti. We remind you that please, all questions you would like to make, we'll have at the end some time for questions and answers. Please let us know through the chat. If you would like to make the questions in Spanish, it's okay. We can translate them to our panelists. And probably Richard may also answer some questions in his English. We are fond that he has quite good knowledge of English and Chile in particular as well. So not taking more time from what we really want to hear, I would like to introduce first Dr. Richard Newfarmer. The floor is yours.
Excelente, muchísimas gracias, Felipe. Es bueno estar con ustedes hoy. Iba a estar en persona porque mi hija acaba de dar luz a mi segunda nieta la semana pasada, pero infelizmente no me dejan entrar en Chile hasta ahora. Entonces, pero dentro de un par de semanas, ojalá que el aeropuerto abre. Les voy a hablar en inglés simplemente porque mejor que no me entiendes en inglés que no me entiendes en español. Entonces, también puedo hablar mucho más rápido en inglés y cubrir más territorio. So with that, let me just see if I can figure out how to share my screen here. Whoops, wait a minute, I'm going the wrong direction. And we'll have a little bit of a slideshow. Let's just see if this is going to go the right, whoops. Can you see this, Felipe? Felipe?
No, for the moment we still see you. We'll share the screen.
Okay, hang on just one moment. I thought I clicked on share screen, but share screen, share. Okay, there we go.
Yes, now we're seeing your screen.
We can see it, yes.
Okay, super. So, Felipe asked me to talk a little bit about trade COVID-19 in Africa, and I thought I'd just sort of float by some general ideas. The first is that COVID-19 is having a really devastating effect on Africa, but not so much through the disease itself as through the policy stringency that has been adopted in response to the threat of the COVID-19, as well as the effects of global trade and investment recession. In fact, all four channels of globalization are transmitting very substantial external shocks from the north to Africa: merchandise trade, tourism, capital flows, and remittances. I thought maybe I'd talk a little bit about Uganda as well as one representative example. It's suffering through all four shocks, and I think it's kind of worth drilling down a little bit and talking about how those play through. And then maybe I'll end with a couple of thoughts on how, even though the risks are high, there's, I think, permanent shifts in globalization that are likely to come out of this that may create new opportunities for Africa. And actually, many of these, I think, pertain to Chile as well. This graph shows the global pandemic spread around the world. And you can see that really it's the North America, the Latin America, and Europe that has suffered the most from the pandemic, just in terms of the spread of the disease. Surprisingly enough, Africa, near the bottom of the screen, has had very little impact so far in terms of as a percentage of the population. So that's the good news. I think there's several reasons for this. The first reason is that the region had had experiences with pandemics before and took them very seriously. So, for example, when I was in Rwanda and Uganda in February, this was after the pandemic had begun already in China, as you know, and already hit the United States. Already in Rwanda and Uganda, they were putting out hand sanitizer in virtually all the hotels and at the entrance to every major office building. So it was really quite a quick response. Secondly, it was fairly aggressively applied. This was not optional. And the other thing that I think may have helped Africa out is the relatively young age of the population. And that, of course, has meant that it didn't spread quite as quickly. This graph, I think, demonstrates the sort of the aggressive nature of the, hang on just one moment, I'm gonna try to do one thing here. The aggressive nature of the policy. This is the policy stringency index that Oxford University has put together. And as you can see, the measures that were imposed beginning really in March and moving forward were quite quick and quite stringent. And I think that helped the region considerably. But the fact is the risks remain quite high in Africa. One, we know that the cases are building. And secondly, we hope that maybe they've peaked in Kenya and South Africa and Nigeria. The numbers in August were down a little bit. Maybe Tabitha can tell us a little bit more. But I think the potential for major disaster really lurks on the horizon. Why is that? Well, the opportunities for social distancing is far less. Systems of transport are much more crowded. As you may know, a lot of the public transportation in Africa is via motorcycle taxis. And of course, this puts people in direct contact with other people, potentially. Markets tend to be crowded, though they're outdoors, that's the good news, but they tend to be very crowded. And then of course, crowded living spaces. Moreover, the number of people having access to water and in their house is quite limited. So many villages, for example, will either get water from a river or they'll get water from a communal tap in the center of the village. So the opportunity for hand washing is substantially less. And then finally, I think health status is simply much poorer. And of course, the number of doctors per 1,000 people is 1/100th of what it is in a country like Chile. So the risk is really quite great. The good news is because of that delay, it may be that a vaccine will come online or that therapeutics will make it possible to defer any major crisis if in fact Africa can hold out a little bit longer. Of course, what this has meant is that growth has pretty much collapsed throughout the world. This graph, which was done by the International Institute of Finance, I threw up because it shows the forecast that was in the fall for the major markets around the world economy, mature markets, United States, and what the forecast was in April. Well, and even since April, of course, things have gotten, in fact, substantially worse. The growth forecast put out in June by the IMF was minus 4.9% for the world. I mean, this is a huge and catastrophic fall. The WTO put out trade forecasts ranging from 12.9% to 31.9%. Tourism is expected to fall 58 to 78%. This is a major crisis for both income to the region as well as the airlines, as LATAM Airlines well knows. Remittances are down 20% by some estimates, and foreign direct investment, according to UNCTAD, is also down substantially. I'll show you a couple of pictures because it's quite dramatic. If you look at where the pandemic began, it's the major markets of the world, China and the United States. This is Germany. And this graph shows the global network of intermediate trade based on a study that Taglioni and Matu did in 2020. And you can see that when you hit those big countries, the United States and China, you affect all countries of the world rather quickly. And I think that's what we see, of course, in Africa. Similarly, commodity prices fell precipitously. This graph shows the index from January, the beginning of the year, up through recently, mid-June. Of course, oil prices are down, cotton prices are down. Only gold is up. Felipe was telling me that copper prices have bounced back a little bit. I think that's a good sign. The other good thing, I think, from Africa's standpoint is that coffee prices have managed to recover. And I can only think that's because people quarantined, had nothing else to do but stream on Zoom and drink coffee at the same time, I suppose. Tourism worldwide has collapsed. I like this graph because it shows 2000 to 2020 arrivals. And as you can see, according to the UN WTO, estimates fall anywhere from 58 to 78%. I mean, this is a catastrophic decline because tourism is a major foreign exchange earner for probably a third of all of African countries. We'll see the effects on Uganda in just a minute. Foreign direct investment also collapsing. This comes in the wake of a sustained sort of stagnation in foreign direct investment worldwide. You can see in this graph put together by UNCTAD that in 2019, some $1.5 trillion in foreign investment around the world was being made. The first dotted line is the depths to which it fell in the 2009 crisis. And then there's a projection down an additional 40%. So of course the effects in Africa, although it's not a big beneficiary of this quantity of a big share of this trillions of dollars of foreign direct investment, it's very important for the economies themselves. Similarly, what we know is that we did a little simulation here, looking at a global GTAP model. Some of you may know this, and we wanted to analyze the effects of various shocks on the African economy. And so this shows the change in income relative to the base projection. And we modeled, in this particular graph, I'll show you three different shocks. The first shock on the left-hand column is a collapse of world growth in the OECD countries and everywhere outside of sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. That immediately transmits a shock of 1.8% to relative to trend growth. If you add to that, and this is cumulative, the increase in international trade costs associated with the lockdowns in various places, as well as the drop in tourism, you're down to a total of 5.4% off the baseline projection, a huge drop. And then finally, when you add to that the effect of the recession in South Asia, as well as sub-Saharan Africa, you're down almost 10%, 9.4% relative to the baseline forecast. So the shock, the cumulative shock is pretty dramatic here. If you look at the growth rates that are projected now, what we see in Africa is a growth rate down, according to IMF June projections, of 3.2%. I think the point here is that that 3.2% represents a 5.4% cut in per capita income. And when you're talking about per capita income somewhere between $500 and $1,000 per year, you can see this is a real big hit for the poor people of the world. There is a projected bounce back a little bit. The yellow dots there were the earlier projection for April, pretty irrelevant now, but you can see that the shift has been down pretty dramatically. If you sort of decompose that into the oil exporters of Africa, other resource-intensive countries in Africa, the non-resource-intensive countries, and the tourism-dependent economies, what you see is that the oil exporters are hurt the most after the tourism-dependent economies. This is Mauritius and many of the economies, some of the economies of Northern Africa, but also even economies like Uganda and Rwanda, where tourism is the leading source of export earnings, is quite sharp. The non-resource intensive economies, which are more rural, they are focused a lot on agriculture. There's some manufacturing and some, of course, sale of raw materials in the form of agricultural products to the international market. They were hurt somewhat less. So maybe that's the good news in all of this. If you look at merchandise trade January through April of this year, you can see the huge fall. First of all, the blue columns, just kind of focus on the blue columns for a moment. You'll see the pretty sharp fall from, this is month over month, by the way, relative to 2019, from about 10% in January, a 10% increase relative to January 2019, all the way down to a 30% fall in total trade in April. This is a rather catastrophic fall, needless to say. Intra-regional exports, the orange column there, have declined a little less rapidly and a little less overall. And then finally, the export to the rest of the world from Africa have fallen really quite dramatically, as might be expected from the commodity composition of Africa's agricultural total exports. In fact, merchandise exports, about half are raw materials and commodities to the rest of the world. So that's the reason. If you look at the links to global value chains, this was done by a paper, Jim DeMello and Anna Chum, a colleague of mine in Rwanda. They looked at regional value chains and non-regional value chains. I like this graph because it shows across the x-axis the regional value chain integration as a share of total exports versus on the vertical axis, the non-regional value chain integration. And as you can see, sub-Saharan Africa, to the extent they participate in global value chains, it's really all through the commodity window of and related sales to the non-African countries. This is a pattern, by the way, just simply more exaggerated than Latin America has, with the exception of NAFTA. East Asia is much more integrated in terms of regional value chains. But when you think, going back to that first graph that I mentioned, where you have China and the United States and Europe as being the epicenters of the COVID-19 crisis, you can see why this is transmitted back to Africa in a virulent way. The shutdowns of the countries in response, remember that policy stringency graph that I showed you, also had very substantial effects. We can see this is the effect of the Uganda-Kenyan border on May 27th, 2020. And because several policies had been put in place with border shutdowns, although they tried to keep commercial trade alive, here you see trucks backed up some 35 kilometers with an average wait of 4 days, just simply to get across the Uganda-Kenyan border. And of course, what that means is that you have a sort of a supply side shock to the importing country, in this case, let's say those imports coming from Kenya to Uganda. Why was that? Well, it was because they were testing the drivers at the border. In fact, most of the cases of COVID-19 coming into Uganda came from Kenya via the truck drivers, interestingly enough. Of course, they had shut the airports much earlier. And likewise, the same thing was true in Rwanda as well. So they enacted immediately testing at the border. They wiped down all of the trucks And this, of course, caused enormous havoc at the border and considerable dissatisfaction. In any case, the cost of the policy stringency, however useful on the benefit side, had a real cost in terms of driving up the cost of imports and down the earnings from exports. So let me say a little bit about Uganda, and I'll just locate this in space for those of you that are not familiar with Africa. Uganda is this landlocked country where that's in pink here, surrounded by Tanzania, Kenya, South Sudan, the DRC, and the like. So basically, population 35 million, roughly, twice the size of Chile, but with 1/10 the size of its GDP. So you understand how poor Uganda is in relation to a country like Chile. $740 per capita annual income. Exports to GDP, about 20%, imports about 30%, the difference being largely financed through foreign capital inflows, including development assistance. The effects on the COVID-19 were really on the import side, mostly in the first phase. So you see a very sharp fall between January and April of imports. That's the top line. Exports fell somewhat as well, but not nearly as sharply into January. If there's any ray of sunshine here, it's that there has been a bit of a bounce back from April, as there have been some recovery of regional trade, particularly, but also coffee exports have gone up fairly substantially from Uganda. So that's the good news. But this import contraction was pretty sharp and severe. If you look at how it played through the import portfolio, my colleague Jacob Ruschendorfer and John Spray did a fairly detailed analysis of this for Uganda. And we see that consumption goods basically appear to be surviving more or less at the level that they had before. There's a bit of a dip, but it's not catastrophic. The real effects have been through capital goods and through intermediates. This is really important because the capital goods numbers I think are reflecting investment demand, of course. And what this means is that investment is being postponed, particularly in the public sector. And the cost to that will likely ripple out several years in advance. And similarly, the intermediate goods contraction has been quite sharp as well. And that has implications for exports, because many of these imports go into exports, as well as into production locally. Tourism, as I mentioned, has been dramatically felt worldwide. Here's the actual earnings for the first quarter. They use a fiscal year that runs July through June. So when it says Q4, it really means May through April through June of 2020. And you can see that this shows the various sectors: agriculture, industry, and services, and tourism. And even though agriculture fell a little bit, industry fell also a little bit, services have really fallen back very sharply. Why was that? Well, part of that was the lockdown effects. When you basically shut all the restaurants, you shut down urban transportation, the effect on services trade is pretty dramatic. But tourism has just been hammered. You can see that in this quarter. So this year's performance, which is Q3 and Q4, essentially first half of the year, the calendar year, have just been really pretty bleak. And if you look at foreign capital inflows, you see the same picture. Foreign direct investment and remittances are both down. Foreign investment, looking across the two columns, the July through December of 2019 number was 576. Actually, this is sort of screwed up. I'm sorry. Look at the difference. There was basically an increase in foreign investment of 49 million US dollars. In the first half of this year, however, there's been a $277 million fall already relative to what it was in 2018, 2019. That represents like a 40% fall in the story. Remittances, on the other hand, have kind of held up, at least not as, they haven't fallen as quite as sharply as they have as many had feared. They're likely to be down only about 11% for the year. So that's a good news, partly because many of the immigrants, of course, in the OECD countries are themselves unemployed or suffering income losses. So the fact that this was maintained, I think, was very important. So, Felipe, how am I doing on time here? I've kind of lost track. Should I wind up? I'll skip this story. Yeah.
Maybe 5 more minutes, and then we go with Tabitha.
Okay. One of the consequences of an import collapse has been on the domestic supply chain. My colleagues, Rauschendorfer and Spray, did an analysis using VAT data. And what they see is this is 2 factories. The blue are 2 factories. They buy from 340 different Ugandan suppliers. They sell to 135 Ugandan wholesalers. And those wholesalers sell on to 1,548 firms. So these 2 factories are really important to the Ugandan economy. And likewise, if you add to that the import side of the story, those 2 factories import from 96 foreign suppliers from 28 different countries. So the transmission effect to the economy of interruption of that import supply chain is really important and has consequences that ramify throughout the economy. What they found using a simulation is that reducing imports about in line with the COVID-19 shock actually put about 6.6% of active firms out of business. And it had a 5% negative effect on formal employment. This, of course, ramified throughout, particularly the economy as a whole, but manufacturing, tea and coffee production, hospitals, and transport sector were among the most affected according to their simulations. So let's talk a little bit about just looking to the future, what's changed, new opportunities, and how to adapt. I think a couple of things are likely to happen here. One is that we're seeing an acceleration of many trends that were already evident in the global economy. But some are new. Some things that I think are new in the case of Africa generally, Uganda in particular, I'm really quite worried about the effects on child nutrition of some of the income falls in rural areas. Remittances turns out to be a big channel into the rural areas. And if those fall, people tend to eat lower quality food and less of it, and the effects on child nutrition could be substantial. There's likely to be business consolidations. Many businesses are going out of business. And of course, I worry about resurgent protectionism, both within the region and vis-a-vis the region. You all know very well about the erosion of multilateral rules and cooperation. The United States has been particularly egregious in its performance under the American First Doctrine of Donald Trump. We can talk about that. Thirdly, there's already a beginning trends of shrinking global supply chains, which we saw even pre-crisis. I think the fact that we're now seeing an interruption of many of these supply chains, you're likely to see an intensification of trying to locate production closer to the consumer. Then finally, the Zoom revolution. Yes, we're participating in it right now, but of course what this has meant is that we're seeing more and more people working from home, particularly in the OECD countries. First of all, some 70% of business surveyed recently in the United States indicated they would like to keep workers working at home. Why is this? It's because they can have less office space. REI is one example that you may know, has abandoned its headquarters. Its newly built headquarters it's decided not even to move into, and instead have workers move from home. Other consequences are a sharp decline in business travel, which is going to have an effect both on the airlines and tourist earnings. And then I think we should begin thinking about the digitech and global robotics transformation that Richard Baldwin has been talking about. You know, the idea that the manufacturing is going to be increasingly less labor intensive on the one hand, but services are likely to be treated even more. So this, of course, opens up new opportunities for Africa. Let me just mention a few here. I do think that the effort to build resilient supply chains across several new product lines is likely to benefit those countries that are able to jump in and poach particular types of production process for their countries. What that means is low tariffs are really important. Good logistics and trade facilitation are really important. Secondly, Zoom has opened up services exports in really new ways that we hadn't thought about. Let me give you one example. There was a teacher in New York who no longer able to teach his students in person, was forced to teach his classes online, decided that he would take advantage of the incentives that Barbados was giving to move to Barbados and teach his class in New York from Barbados. Well, that opportunity, I think, is really multiplied millions-fold for both Africa and other countries. I think regional value chains are likely to become much more important. And of course, the trade opportunities associated with new agreements on the standing communities. We have the East Africa Community, ECOWAS, COMOS. There's also the new agreements with the EU, the EPA, as many of you know this, and AGOA. And of course, the African free trade, continental free trade arrangement could be important. India and somehow China and somehow India as well dropped off this slide in the translation from Microsoft to iOS system, but India and China offer real new opportunities and are beginning to have free trade agreements with Africa. What are the policy implications? Skills, skills, skills. Education is going to be really important in the new world of services trade. Connectivity in all dimensions is going to be really important. And then we've got to deal with the problem of fiscal consolidation. So let me stop there, Felipe, and pardon me for having gone on for so long here, but it really is an interesting topic in my view.
Thank you very much. I think it's been quite interesting. Some figures are quite shocking, but it's what's happening and looking forward to what's going to bring the future. So we will move on to Tabitha. So here you are.
Yeah, thank you very much, Felipe, and thank you, Professor Richard. You've actually covered almost everything that I wanted to say, so we might as well stop the webinar. But,
I'm sure you'll say it better.
Yes, but it is very interesting how you're looking at the same thing and you can actually look at it in a different way. So, anyway, thank you so much, Felipe, for inviting me to present something on Africa, COVID-19, and rather trade, COVID-19 and Africa. And I'll do a presentation, it's a short one. And okay. I'm hoping that you can see what I'm presenting.
Yes.
Yes.
If we can see you, maybe you can put it full screen so it's.
Okay, let me see. Okay, let me see. Can you see now?
Yeah, but maybe if you could put the slideshow mode.
Yes.
More than the zoom of the PowerPoint, the full screen presentation. That's...
Okay, let me see. Okay, just give me a minute. Just give me a minute. Okay. Okay. I think I'll just share and see how it will come.
Okay.
Okay.
Just turn the screen. Yeah, that would be fine, I think. That's okay.
Are we okay? Okay. Let me see. Yes, well, as Professor Richard has already said that COVID originated from China in December 2019. And of course, it spread rapidly throughout the world, and it caught up with a number of other countries, and we realized it around March. And of course, when it started spreading in China, it impacted negatively on economic activities in China. And most of the activities in China actually almost came to a halt. And we all know that China is a major exporter of commodities to the African countries. And with that, it meant that most of the African countries were also impacted the same way as China was impacted negatively because of the spillovers. And COVID-19 impacted negatively on social interaction and of course, economic activities through imposed social distancing, as Newfarmer has said. And of course, this had impact on different levels of strictness and in several African countries. There were some that were less strict, like Tanzania, and Kenya, and a number of other countries were very strict, including South Africa.
Tabitha, maybe they're just telling us if you could put press just the presentation from the current slide that's in the top.
Okay, Paran, can you? Okay, could you?
On your right, it says from the current slide, start slideshow from the current slide.
Oh, slideshow.
Just have to move your mouse to your left.
Okay, give me a second.
Just below home and insert.
Just below home. Okay, give me a second then.
Or press F5 also. Yes, that's the button.
Let me stop sharing then. Or what did you say?
Yes, just if you press F5 on the computer, it should also turn into presentation mode.
Okay, fine. Just give me a minute. F5. Well, I didn't. Okay.
No, then we'll just try to tell you. If you go with your mouse to your left.
My left, yes.
Go just all the way to the left and up until there it says from current slide. There's an icon just in the toolbar.
Okay.
It's just it's a second icon from left to right.
Okay.
Can you see it?
No.
Just if you see COVID-19 in your presentation.
Okay, COVID-19.
Go up,
yes.
and then to the left.
Okay.
Any of them should work.
Okay. Oh, there it is. Are we okay now?
Yeah, now you can just go.
Yes, there we are. Thank you so much, Felipe. And sorry for that. So I had already started and saying that the COVID-19 originated from Wuhan province in China in December 2019, spread rapidly in China and to other parts of the world, especially in early 2020. And it affected negatively on the economic activity in China. And in February, we all know that the economic activities in China almost came to a halt. And we all know that most of the commodities we find in African shops, manufacturing and all that, most of them come from China because China is a major exporter of commodities to African countries. And when the economy of China almost came to a halt, the spillovers affected and had negative consequences on African countries. And since African countries rely heavily on China for the supply of primary and intermediate raw materials. And as I had already mentioned that COVID-19 affected social interaction and economic activities through imposed social distance policies. And these differed by country. There were some countries that are very strict and others were not as strict. For example, Tanzania was not as strict as Kenya. Uganda was even stricter than Kenya. And as I have said that before we even come to Africa, we could think of how did COVID-19 affect world trade? And I may reiterate that, Richard said that, the global economy was disrupted by COVID-19 and world trade as such, because production was scaled back, consumption was also scaled back across the globe. And in June, on 23rd June 2020, the WTO forecast the volume of global merchandise trade would fall by between 13% and 32% in 2020. Now, it also forecast a 10.6% decline in export for sub-Saharan Africa. And what you see there is a graph showing the prediction in exports in selected regions. And you'll see that United States had the most negative impact. Sorry, let me go back. Yeah, United States had the highest negative impact, the highest change in percentage in exports, followed by India, followed by Asian region, China, the EU, and sub-Saharan Africa to some extent, the fall was 10.6%, and Middle East, that is the MENA region, it was the lowest, 10.5%. And in Africa, UNCTAD 2020 says that global merchandise trade declined by about 5% in the first quarter of 2020, but forecast a fall of 27% for the second quarter. And you can see that's quite heavy. That is according to UNCTAD. On the other hand, the World Bank is, forecast an 11% and 7% decline in exports and imports for the sub-Saharan region for 2020. Now, UNCTAD 2020 notes that total African imports declined by 21% and export by 36% in April. And of course, these are what interest for trade for the rest of the 2020, because this was as at April. And if the trends that were really worrying at that time continued, then these were portended, something drastic in terms of a fall in exports and imports. Now, what happened, what was there before COVID? Now, we all know that before COVID, international trade flows had been on an increase. And Africa's trade with the rest of the world had also been increasing. For example, UNCTAD's 2019 report shows that in the period 2015 and 2017, the total trade from Africa to the rest of the world averaged $760 billion in current prices, while the share of Africa's total trade to the rest of the world had also been increasing. I'll have to push this to the side. On the other hand, intra-African trade, that is trade between African countries in terms of exports and imports, was very minimal, around 2% during the same period, 2015 and 2017. Now, intra-African exports were only 16.6% of total exports in 2017, and this was much lower compared with 16.1% in Europe, 59.4% in Asia, 55% in America, and 7% in Oceania. So what were the reasons for this growth in trade flows? One is reduction in trade barriers. there were reduced transportation costs, especially because of trade facilitation. Tariffs and non-tariff barriers and transactions costs were also very low. But because of COVID, non-tariff measures have increased, both in terms of the number of products covered and the number of countries covering them. For example, we all know that a number of countries imposed restrictions on movement. They imposed restriction on vehicles entering the borders because of borders were closed. And so non-tariff measures have actually increased more than ever before. And the number of products also covered have increased. So now, after the COVID-19 was declared a pandemic, countries reacted by putting a number of restrictions, for example, on non-essential business and travel. They declared curfews. They shut down facilities that were considered good transmission areas of virus, instructing workers to work from home. For example, we have been working from home since March 16, and we had a curfew from 6 o'clock to 5 o'clock in the morning, and so many people have lost their jobs, and so a number of countries have putting these kinds of restrictions meant that trade was also impacted. And there are first channels by which this lockdown and other efforts influenced economic activity. For example, the forced reduction in production as a result of the national lockdown and other restrictions on non-essential business operations was one channel, the reduction in production. Secondly, there was the impact of the lockdown on household demand for goods and especially services. For example, as Richard shows, tourism was impacted negatively as a result of travel and movement restrictions because flights were actually halted. Now, there was also an effect, the effect of disrupted global production and supply chains on African exports, as Richard has shown. And there was also another channel of the effect of uncertainty on business investment. I mean, who would want to, at that particular time, even think of investing in another country? So now countries imposed non-tariff measures, for example, closing of border points, lockdowns, quarantines, curfews, and these act as brakes on both trade flows and the global economy. And of course, this also led in a rise in trade costs from additional border controls, transport and associated logistics, related disruptions, and these account for a third of the decline in world trade, from 12% to 32%. Now, governments have put in place measures such as channeling traffic through fewer border crossings because, the testing is usually at the border before you cross to another country. Drivers have got to be tested and it takes time. And so a number of countries reduce the number of border points or border crossings because of reduced manpower also. They were conducting at the border health checks, and in some cases, they reintroduced border controls that had previously been removed. And all countries, both developed and developing, have been affected by COVID-19. There were mass production shutdowns, supply chains disrupted due to the rare twin supply-demand shock on the supply side and also reduced demand. Now, this created a ripple effect across all global economic sectors, causing further uncertainty all over the world, Africa included. Now, transport and logistics sector were negatively impacted by COVID-19. Transport and logistics, we all know, are the main cogs in the wheel of facilitating cargo movement to or from different geographical regions. They support key economic sectors such as manufacturing, agriculture, aid and relief, construction, education, and so on and so forth. Flights were canceled, ships were stopped in high seas, ports, both sea and inland ports, were considered epicenters of COVID-19 infections, and our own port in Mombasa was such an example. Now, while borders remain open for freight transportation, drivers are subject to border controls for quarantine purposes, leading to a slowdown of logistic flows. Now, yesterday in the news, Kenyan drivers traveling to Mombasa, traveling to Uganda, Rwanda, DRC, and actually, they staged sit down or a demonstration because Uganda has introduced testing on the other side of the border, disregarding the certificates that the drivers have. And of course, that has led to, slowing the logistic flows. And what you see there is a traffic snarl-up, 45 kilometers along the Nairobi-Maraba Road. This is going to the Busia border, 45 kilometers. And so with this kind of thing, what is happening at the border is delays at the border post, because you cannot cross the border until you have been cleared. And of course, this has led to a lot of delays. And of course, it also means that the goods cannot arrive to where they are required. And it also leads to increased costs, because the drivers usually stay at the border for a minimum of 4 to 5 days. That's an added cost. Now, sectors such as distribution, especially trading services, tourism, and passenger transport have been heavily affected. Mobility-related measures have created significant disruptions in air, maritime, and land transportation, with severe repercussions on goods trade and supply chains. And trade in certain modes of supply has experienced severe downturns. We all know the 4 modes of consumption. For example, supply under mode 2, that is consumption abroad, which is relevant for tourism, has been paralyzed. Travel restriction has also been severely limited, that is mode 4, that is temporary movement of natural persons across borders. The pandemic has also affected the supply of services through mode 3, that is commercial presence, both due to its impact on existing operations in foreign markets and its influence on decision concerning the setup of new establishment. And you saw Richard showing that FDIs have actually gone down. Now, the effect of the pandemic on growth, I think Richard mentioned this. World Bank reports that economic growth in sub-Saharan Africa will decline from 2.4% in 2019 to between -2.1% and -5.1% in 2020 as a result of the pandemic. However, this will depend on the success of the measures taken to mitigate the pandemic effects. Now, the decline, especially in Africa, will largely be due to contractions caused by reliance on exports of commodities whose prices have crashed, as well as other structural issues. For example, countries that rely on oil, on extractives, these ones have been impacted negatively. Now, this affects Africa's participation in trade and value chains, as well as reduce foreign financing flows. Now, of course, given the limited regional market, we saw the intra-African trade is only 2.2%. Trade with the rest of the world is vital for Africa at this time. Now, when you consider the landlocked countries, Uganda is one of the landlocked countries that Richard considered. Now, Economic Intelligence Unit suggests that landlocked countries are going to be the hardest hit. For example, the EIU predicts that annual exports for Rwanda, Uganda, and Burundi will decline by 37%, 34%, and 22% respectively, but experience smaller but still large declines in their imports. Now, what we have there is an effect of trade in the EAC countries. For example, this is predicted, and you see that landlocked countries like Rwanda, the change in imports, that is the red bar, is much smaller compared with the change in exports. You look at Uganda, the change in imports is minus 34.3%, while the change in exports, so the change in exports is minus 34.3%, compared to the change in imports, it's much smaller. The same thing with Burundi, it's more than 20%, but Uganda, Tanzania, both, it's only minus 0.7%, change in exports. And for Kenya, it's actually an increase in exports, slightly by 1.8%, and a slight decrease in imports. So the question is, why the difference between Tanzania and Kenya and the landlocked countries? Now, what you see is that the effects of trade in Kenya and Tanzania are not as grave as their landlocked neighbors. Now, this is mainly because Kenya and Tanzania have access to international trade through the ports of Dar es Salaam and Mombasa, and this may have minimized the cost of the restrictions on the movement and border closures that have occurred due to the crisis, because the landlocked countries are actually depending on, say, for example, Uganda, Rwanda, DRC, and Burundi too. They're actually depending on Kenya and Tanzania, because they are the ones that have got ports, for goods to come through their ports, and of course they are re-exported to these countries. So some countries like Kenya have gained in the first quarter of 2020 compared to the same period in 2019, and especially because of having a port. For example, what we have there is quarterly trade for Kenya, March-May 2019, compared with March-May 2020 in millions of shillings. And what you see is March-May 2019, the domestic exports were 129,637 million, and re-exports, that is those commodities that pass through Kenya and they are re-exported to the neighbors, slightly small, 18,303 million, and total exports were 147,940. But you'll also see that imports during that period in 2019 was 431,240. Of course, we imported more than we exported. And total volume of trade was 579,181 million Kenya shillings. And home use imports was 405,947 million Kenya shillings. Now, when you compare with March-May 2020, you'll actually see that there was a drop in domestic exports by 1.9%, a rise in re-exports of 24.4%, because the landlocked countries were actually depending on Kenya. Total exports increased slightly by 4.7%, and total imports actually dropped by 15%. And the volume of trade, you'll also see that it's increased, rather it dropped by, let's see, by 10%. I should have a negative there. And home use imports were minus 25.6%. And so you actually see that during this period, the period March-May 2019 compared with March-May 2020, apart from an increase in re-exports of 24.4%, the rest, and an increase in domestic export by 1.9%, the total imports dropped, volume of trade also dropped, and of course, home use imports also dropped drastically.
Tabitha, we can't hear you at the moment. Tabitha, I don't know whether you can hear me, but we have lost connection with you at this moment. Yes, no. Well, briefly, we have lost Tabitha's connection for the moment. She was just to wrap up. Hope she may rejoin us for the last part of the questions. But well, I would like to thank both Richard and Tabitha for their presentations, and would like to to open the floor for any questions or comments. We still have Richard in the webinar, so hope he would be able to and willing to respond to some questions from the audience. So I don't know whether there are any questions you would like to make it through the chat or just open your mic and intervene. I would like to open the floor at the moment. See, Constanza Gajardo, do you have a question? Would you like to? Questions to Kate? I'll just check.
Hello.
On the email. Yes, please.
Yes. Yes. Sorry. Hello. Thanks, Felipe, for this interesting webinar. Thanks, Richard and Tabitha. I'm a diplomat from the University of Chile here in Kenya, and has been very, very interesting presentations. I think that actually, yeah, it was very interesting to see the difference between the vision from Richard and Tabitha here in Kenya. The reality we are seeing here in Kenya is that actually we are still curious about how COVID seems not to be affecting population as strong as in other countries around the world. But yeah, all the impact, economic impact is being horrible for population. And so I would like to ask Richard about what even if it's difficult to do like a forecast, how things will be here, but regarding the change, the economic global value chains here in Africa, regarding the trade, sorry, I forgot now the name of the African economic trade they were just signing last year, but yeah, all things were stopped. So maybe opportunities that African countries can have regarding this crisis, because things will be different now. Countries will be in front of challenges for their own economies. So African countries maybe will have an opportunity to be obligated in some way to be integrated before than they thought. Yes, that will be my question. I don't know if Tabitha can hear me. I wanted to thank her and yes, and to do a similar question for her. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Constanza. We have Professor Alejandro Jara in line. So please, if you would like to make your question, and afterwards we will leave Richard for some answers. And I have already two other questions for a second round from Kate van der Braak and Camila Flores. So Professor Jara, if you would like to take the floor, and then Richard to answer.
Thank you, Felipe, and thank you for the presentations. And it's always very nice to see a dear friend such as Richard, and congratulations on his grandson, granddaughter, I forget what it was, and I hope to see him in Chile very soon. My question is, taking into account all the efforts that have been made for regional integration in Africa, and very ambitious efforts, the expectation is that despite all the difficulties in crossing borders, et cetera, at the end, the pandemic, will it be a block to further integration, or will this be an opportunity to precisely use the regional integration as part of the solution to economic recovery? I suppose it requires a lot of coordination among the governments, but really this could be taken as an opportunity. But I'd like to have your views on that. Thank you.
I will change slightly the order because taking on Professor Hara's question, I would like to add also Kate van der Brad question as well. As she asked to Richard, what are the implications of COVID on the implementation of the Africa Continental Free Trade area? And will it dampen the potential gains and opportunities once predicted by the AFCFTA? So to add in to the question. Thank you very much. And we have Tabitha back online. Thank you, Tabitha.
Thank you. Can I finish?
Hmm?
Can I just finish 2 slides?
Yeah, sure. Richard, would be okay, and then we wrap up the questions?
Yes, yeah, let me just finish. Okay, can you allow me to share?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, I was talking about lessons learned. I'm sorry for that. I had a power interruption. Those are some of the things that we go through in developing countries. So I was talking about, lessons learned. And one of the things that, that is important for African countries to do is economic diversification. And I said, not just diversifying the products, but also diversifying the countries that they do trade with, not just concentrating on a few, and also need for strengthening the few strategic sectors, for example, food, the food sector, and the health sector. And we all know what happened because the COVID-19 pandemic required that people, the doctors, the health personnel had to use what we call PPEs, and these were actually not available, and every country was scrabbling to purchase whatever was there, and of course the prices rose, and of course that actually gave impetus for African governments, Kenya included, to start thinking of how they can start manufacturing their own PPEs, their own, a number of things started happening, meaning that there was already potential that was not being utilized. Secondly, there is need for improvement of basic infrastructure and efficiency, and especially in the agro-processing capacity. And I think Richard has also said that there is need for Africa to embrace the digital age and adopt more of the digital technologies, both for production and services, such as e-banking, e-retailing, e-learning, and especially in public services. For example, these days we are actually teaching our students online. We are actually conducting examinations online. You actually purchase your goods online and they are brought right to your door. Banking, we are not handling cash. We are actually using M-Pesa, what we call M-Pesa, that is mobile money. And you're also proposing that Africa must strengthen intra-regional trade, because if Africa was doing more trade amongst itself, it couldn't have found itself in such situation, because when other countries were impacted negatively, what was left for Africa to trade with its neighbors? Then secondly, okay.
If you may again use the slide show.
Yes, I'm trying to. Okay,
yes,
slide. Okay. Okay. And so I was also saying that there's need to make concerted efforts to harmonize trade-related regulations. For example, what we are seeing is that countries are actually coming up with their own regulations at the border, imposing certain regulations that are not compatible with their neighbors, custom controls, and there's need to reduce both tariff and non-tariff barriers. And there's also need to improve the infrastructure and connectivity to lower the logistic costs. And we are also saying, I think Richard mentioned this, that the pandemic provides an opportunity to take more concrete steps towards realizing the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. And Africa needs more international trade agreements to support its growing and still fragile export sectors. For example, Kenya is trying to come up with a trade agreement between itself and the United States. And it means that there is need to have minimum of these trade agreements so that whenever something like that happens, like another pandemic happens, then it cannot find itself in a situation. Then Africa not only needs the existing favorable treaties, such as AGOA, I think Richard mentioned, everything but arms, but also should pursue more such treaties with other major economies, including India, China, Japan, and other such markets. Now, again, e-commerce is now the engine driving economies. There is need for greater reliance on online services, connecting supply chains and facilitating merchandise trade. So services such as telecommunication, computing, information services, business services, financial services, audiovisual services that are vital for online supply, and those such as distribution, transport, and logistics that facilitate merchandise trade will help to support trade and economic growth. And thank you very, very much, despite the difficulties that I've gone through trying to do this presentation because of power failure. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Tabitha. I'm really glad you came back. Before you came back, we opened the floor for some questions. Some of them were addressed to Richard. So Richard, you would like to start with this? And if there are any other new questions to Tabitha, we'll receive them through the chat. Richard, thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Felipe. And I think Tabitha has really done a wonderful job in kind of summarizing the policy agenda from the standpoint of regional trade. Costanza asked about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which I think can be really a game changer in terms of changing expectations within the region. As you may know, it was signed in 2019 in July. It was supposed to come into effect, in 2018. It was supposed to come into effect in July of this year. And that has been postponed until January of 2021. 30 of 55 countries have ratified the agreement. So there's still some important economies that are not part of the agreement yet. Nigeria is one, and perhaps the most important in that story. But it does, I think, indicate sort of a willingness to, instead of looking necessarily north-south with the AGOA arrangements, the everything but arms arrangements, or the EPA arrangements, looking instead to south-south arrangements. So I think that's an important signal. Always the devil is in the details. And I think what we've seen in the history of regional agreements is that they're often implemented at half measure and undermined by non-tariff barriers, by failure to implement standards that are in agreement, something that Tabitha mentioned. That said, I am heartened, and this goes to the opportunity side of the story, I'm heartened by the development of a number of industries, which John Page and I were calling industries without smokestacks. And these are often many associated with services trade, tourism, ICT, for example, even some based in agriculture like horticulture and others like transport. The economies of Africa are becoming much more diversified internally, and that's together with the change to services exports has led services exports to be really quite important now for Africa. And it may be easier to integrate some services, for example, retail trade. What we've seen is Mode 3 foreign investors from South Africa come into the EAC, for example, and revolutionize the retail sector within major cities, ShopRite and the like. I think we're likely to see more of that. At the same time, services remain quite restricted. And so, and often the agreements that have been signed, both the regional agreements and even the African Free Trade Area agreement, doesn't give quite enough emphasis to services integration. And so services have lagged. In a way, it's the old style view that let's integrate the trade accounts first and then move on to services, I think is the wrong way to do regional agreements. One other area where I think that's really quite important is the idea of beginning to open up trade with China and formulate new arrangements with China. It's a very big trading partner. It has become the largest trading partner of Africa, as a matter of fact, mainly in raw materials. But I think as the Mauritius-China trade agreement has recently shown, there is opportunity, and it's such a big market. And China, you know, doesn't care about giving Mauritius any entrance to its services sector or even wholly owned subsidiaries, because Mauritius is such a small little player. So fine, let's give this country access. But for Mauritius, that's terribly important. So I think thinking about that in the future. Going to Alejandro's question about what will the pandemic's effect be on trade relations? I'm actually a little bit optimistic. You know, I mean, the shocks have been so severe, and the need of all of the sectors to begin to grow via export and to import, because remember, a lot of those imports coming into Uganda, for example, are being used by exporters to re-export, whether it's importing from Kenya to process and re-export to the DRC, or even re-export to other countries. So I think we're likely to see a deepening of regional value chains in a way that we might not have seen previously, and actually foreign investment might play a role in that. We'll have to see. I mentioned the retailers, retail services operations. You know, if you're a large department store or in Kenya, you know that Uganda, and you have a subsidiary also in Uganda, and you know they make corn-based tortillas or chips that are much better than what's available in Kenya. The transmission of knowledge, I think, could lead to greater exports from Uganda and imports into Kenya in that storyline. So I'm kind of hopeful, Alejandro, that this might work out. I think the regional agreements have associated themselves, have become much better forum for negotiating non-tariff barriers than in the early days. So let me stop there and just emphasize the importance of lowering border barriers as a way of creating regional value chains in the context of these new agreements and to seize these new opportunities.
Thank you very much. I have just two final questions, and maybe it could be for Tabitha as well. One from Camila Flores, student from the Institute, regarding the low numbers on people infected in COVID. Are these because of low traceability, or there are actually lower numbers being perceived in Africa? And from Juan Eduardo Fute, a Chilean diplomat, he asked, what recovery scenarios could be expected in the future, both in mid and long term? Any path plan? Can we expect a rise in sub-regional trade once the countries become able to tackle down the spread among their own regions? I think this would be the final questions. I don't know whether Tabitha or Richard would like to address any of them.
Let's hear from Tabitha.
Yes, I'll look at the first one. I think you asked why the numbers of COVID-19 are low in Africa?
Yes, it would be the first question.
Yes. Okay. First, there are a number of reasons as to why the numbers are low. First, there is very low testing. For example, from March to now, as of today, Kenya has not yet tested 500,000 people. And two, there is very little tracing of people. For example, after interaction and one person has been found to be positive, there is very little contact tracing going on. And number three, the reason as to why there is little testing is because, you know, the reagents and the testing kits, most of them are actually imported. And with every other country in the world also going to the same markets, then you can actually understand why most African countries are actually doing very little testing. And for example, in a day, you can find maybe less than 6,000 people tested. So we can say that, you know, the numbers are low because of little testing, but we can also see that even from the number of people who've been tested, the positivity rate has actually not been very, very high in a number of countries. And you can actually see even in South Africa. So that has been a kind of, you know, what is really happening in Africa. And somebody said, well, it could be that because of the, you know, people, the high levels of poverty and living in crowded places, maybe a number of people already have developed a kind of immunity because they may have been infected by other viruses there before. And so they have developed a kind of an immunity. And so even when they may get infected by this, they will actually be asymptomatic. So those are some of the reasons that are being bandied around as to why the numbers are low. And but we are also praying that they will remain low, and we are actually going to flatten the curve, and we are not going to have another. I mean, we are not going to have another peak. Because if we do, then it is going to be disastrous. Because as Richard has said, we might expect the worst because it will have spread in, there will be what you call, you know, community transmission, as it is happening now, because initially it was concentrated in the major cities, but now it has actually gone into the rural areas. But even as it has gone to the rural areas, the number of people tested, the number of people testing positive is also low. So that is our hope that we are not going to have another peak. I hope I've answered the question. I didn't get the next one. Which one? What was the next one?
I would rephrase the next one, as well as add a couple of the last two questions. One where it's regarding the scenarios, the recovery scenarios that you could see in the near future, not in the near future, in the mid and long term. And I would add the last two questions. One from a person from the Institute, Paola Civetti, who would like to know whether if there is any project of a digital regional market in Africa. And so that's for either Richard or Tabitha. And the final question that is from Akinyi Sasi, that's right directly to Tabitha, is how was Kenya achieve a rise in exports against all odds? What are the goods which have been highly contributed to this rise? And that would be the final questions for both of you. Thank you.
Okay, first let me talk about why Kenya had a rise in exports. And as I said, in my numbers, I actually showed that there was a rise in re-exports. That a number of countries that are actually landlocked were relying on Kenya, and the goods could come to Kenya and they could be re-exported to other countries. Secondly, Kenya and Tanzania, unlike Burundi, unlike Uganda and Rwanda, Kenya and Tanzania have got a port. And so that port is actually used by the East African countries for them to import goods passing through Kenya. So some of the goods, actually there is a value addition through the value chains, and they're actually re-exported to other countries. And that explains why there was a rise in the amount of exports that are coming out of Kenya to the other bordering countries. And then the other question you asked is the scenario in the medium term and the long term. Is that what you asked for? Yes, I think the lesson learned is that there is need to first think of what would I say? That there is need to diversify, and there is need to have regional integration. That before you go out to look for countries across the seas, before you go to Europe, before you go to the US, before you go to Japan and China, what about African countries? So the intra-African trade, I see that this is going to be the in thing in the long term, because as of now, there's still a lot of discussion on the implementation and actualization of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. So to me, the intra-African trade can be the savior of African countries if there is another pandemic. But in the meantime, in the midterm, I see that African countries will still try to continue with the trade that they have been having with other countries, and signing of these international trade agreements, so that they are diversifying, not putting all their eggs in the same basket. I hope I've answered your question.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yes, go ahead, Richard.
No, I certainly concur with what Tabitha has said. Let me just elaborate with three thoughts. The first, on the medium-term path of recovery, I think it's not only likely, but an imperative that regional integration play a much stronger role than in the past. And the reason is because of the structure of production is now becoming much more diversified within the region. And so you see things like food manufacturers, for example, playing a much more important part in regional trade. And differentiated products, I think, are going to eventually be very important from the region. And getting the production closer to the consumer means, you know, it's a lot easier to export something from Kigali to Kampala, a mere 8 hours away, than it is to bring that same product into Kampala from China or from the US. Now that's predicated upon, that idea is predicated upon the second point, which is that it's terribly important that these new regional agreements and the old regional agreements begin to make serious progress on reducing border barriers. And that means exposing themselves to competition. Competition is very important because you need to drive out the less efficient firms, which are in many cases smaller firms. And that allows you to increase the scales of your production and gain productivity as a consequence. And it's that increased productivity that will eventually drive rising incomes. But I think that of course leaves open the question of jobs, which is the next, I think, high issue on the agenda once the COVID crisis passes. Job creation with such a young and growing labor force is going to be really important. And here I look to services and what Paige and I called industries without smokestacks. That is, many of the activities which share the same characteristics as manufacturing, but which create jobs in the form of services particularly will be important. If you combine that with Richard Baldwin's notions of services trade becoming increasingly important as a driver of growth, and the evidence is that we've seen that already, I think Africa can really begin to integrate very, very strongly. So what are the key issues here? Reducing border barriers, connectivity, and increasing the skills of your labor force to make that happen. And as part of that, regional agreements will be really very important.
Well, thank you very much. I think we could keep talking for a long time, but we don't want to keep you locked here in this webinar. So I would like to express my gratitude to both Tabitha and Richard for their excellent presentations. I think we had a really nice talk knowing about Africa. We had participants from different parts in Latin America, the US, and Africa as well. So we're very happy for this positive part on this webinar, the opportunity to connect with people from all parts of the world. And again, I'd like to thank you very much and invite you to continue following our activities and our thoughts on these issues. Thank you very much, Tabitha. Thank you very much, Richard, and all of the participants in this session.
Muchísimas gracias a ti y a todos.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye
Felipe.
bye.
Thank you all.
Thanks. Thank you.
Ciao.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.